the Great Unraveling, the Late Bronze Age collapse, the zenith of the Sun Kings. History is often a slow crawl, a gradual shifting of borders and beliefs. But every few millennia, the world doesn't just change, it breaks. Imagine a world more connected than any that would exist for the next 3,000 years. A world where a merchant in Greece could drink from a cup made in Crete, filled with wine from Canaan, while wearing jewelry crafted from Afghan lapis lazuli. This was the Late Bronze Age, the first truly globalized era of human civilization. Great kings who called each other brother ruled over empires that seemed eternal. The pharaohs of Egypt, the golden kings of Mycenae, the Hittite lords of Anatolia, the Kassite kings of Babylon, and the rising power of Assyria. These were the masters of the known world. In the year 1250 BC, these powers had reached a level of sophistication that was almost modern. They had massive bureaucracies, international treaties, and high-speed chariot warfare. They believed they had mastered the earth. They believed their gods had secured their thrones forever. But they were living in a house of cards, built on a foundation of fragile trade and a climate that was about to turn. By 1177 BC, the Mediterranean was screaming. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in a matter of weeks. Trade routes went silent. Writing itself, the very art of recording thought, was forgotten in the chaos. When the smoke finally cleared, the map of the world had been wiped clean. The bronze web and the palace economy. To understand the collapse, we must first understand the height. The 13th century BC was defined by the Great Powers Club. This was an exclusive group of monarchs who maintained a sophisticated balance of power. They did not just trade goods, they traded culture. We know this because of the Amarna letters, a treasure trove of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt. These clay tablets reveal a world of high-stakes diplomacy, where kings complained about the quality of gold sent as gifts, or negotiated the marriage of princesses to cement alliances. The heart of this world was the palace. Whether it was the sprawling complex of Knossos on Crete, the lion-gated fortress of Mycenae, or the massive mud-brick archives of Hattusa, the palace was the central processing unit of society. Because money as we know it did not exist, these empires operated on a redistributive economy. Every grain of wheat, every jar of olive oil, and every fleece of wool produced by the peasantry was brought to the palace. Scribes recorded these goods on clay tablets, like the linear B tablets found in Greece, and then the palace redistributed them to soldiers, craftsmen, and priests. This system allowed for incredible projects. It built the pyramids of Giza, the massive fortifications of Troy, and the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia. But it was a fragile system. It relied on 100% efficiency and a constant flow of resources. There was no free market to act as a buffer. If the palace stopped functioning, the social contract was void. The people did not work for themselves, they worked for the system. When the system failed to provide food or security, the people had no reason to protect the system. The engine of this entire machine was bronze. In the 13th century BC, bronze was the ultimate technology. It made the best swords, the strongest chariot fittings, and the most durable tools. But bronze is an alloy, consisting of 90% copper and 10% tin. While copper was plentiful in Cyprus, tin was incredibly rare. The nearest major sources of tin were thousands of miles away, in the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan or the far-off islands of Britain. This created a bronze dependency. No kingdom was self-sufficient. To be a great power, you had to be part of a global supply chain. If a war or a natural disaster blocked the tin mines, the armies of the West would eventually run out of weapons. This was the first oil crisis in human history, and it set the stage for total systemic failure. The sky turns to iron, the environmental catalyst. While the kings were busy trading gold, the earth began to revolt. Modern paleoclimatology has provided the smoking gun of the collapse. For centuries, the weather patterns of the Mediterranean had been stable, supporting a population boom. But around 1200 BC, the northern hemisphere entered a period of rapid cooling. A mega-drought began, one that would last for nearly 300 years. We see the evidence in the very soil of the earth. Pollen counts from lake beds in Greece show a sudden disappearance of oak and pine trees, replaced by desert scrub. Oxygen isotope analysis from stalagmites in caves reveals a terrifying drop in rainfall. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, the king's scribes began to record a desperate situation. The Hittites, a landlocked power in central Anatolia, were starving. We find letters from the Hittite queen Pujuhepa to the pharaoh of Egypt, pleading for shipments of grain. "It is a matter of life and death," she wrote. The pharaoh Merneptah recorded that he sent ship after ship of grain to keep alive the land of Hatti. Even the greatest rivals of the age were forced into a desperate humanitarian alliance to keep the world order from falling apart. But the drought was not the only disaster. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a complex web of fault lines. Geologists have discovered that between 1225 and 1175 BC, the region experienced a sequence of massive seismic events known as earthquake storms. This wasn't just one earthquake. It was a chain reaction of tremors that leveled cities from Mycenae to Troy. In a world already weakened by famine and economic strain, the physical destruction of the palace walls was a death blow. The people of the Bronze Age did not have the scientific language to describe a shifting climate or tectonic plates. To them, the gods had turned their backs. The contract between the king and the divine was broken. When the king can no longer provide food and the gods are shaking the earth, the very concept of the state begins to dissolve. The arrival of the Sea Peoples. As the empires of the interior began to crumble, a different kind of pressure was building on the fringes of the world. In the Balkans, the Aegean Islands, and the coast of Italy, people were on the move. These were not professional soldiers looking for conquest. They were refugees of the same climate disaster that was strangling the great powers. Driven by hunger and pushed by migrating tribes in the European interior, they became a tidal wave of humanity. The Egyptian records at Medinet Habu describe them as a conspiracy in their isles. We know them as the Sea Peoples. They were a confederation of tribes, the Peliset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Weshesh. They traveled with their families, their cattle, and their belongings in heavy ox carts. This was not a raid. It was a migration. Some of these people had previously served as mercenaries in the Egyptian and Hittite armies. They knew exactly how the great powers fought. They knew that the invincible chariot armies of the pharaoh were useless in the mountains or in the narrow, burning streets of a city under siege. In 1180 BC, the wave hit the coast of Anatolia. The Hittite Empire, already hollowed out by famine, simply ceased to exist. There was no final heroic battle. The king fled, the capital of Hattusa was looted and burned, and the once mighty Hittites, who had once challenged Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh, vanished from history. They left behind only their monumental stone lions to be buried by the dust of the plateau. The wave then turned south, toward the Levant. The rich merchant cities of the coast, Byblos, Sidon, and the great Ugarit, were next. The king of Ugarit's final letter remains one of the most haunting documents in human history. He wrote to the king of Cyprus, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." The letter was never sent. It was found in the ruins, baked into ceramic by the very fire that destroyed the city. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces. While the Levant was burning, the cradle of Greek civilization was also falling into darkness. The Mycenaeans, the legendary heroes of the Iliad, had built a culture based on war and trade. Their citadels, like Mycenae and Turin's, were built with Cyclopean walls, stones so large that later Greeks believed only giants could have moved them. But even these walls could not keep out the collapse. The fall of Mycenae was not a single event but a slow disintegration. First, the trade routes to the east were cut by the Sea Peoples. Without tin, the Mycenaeans could not maintain their bronze weapons. Then the drought hit the Peloponnese, causing the peasantry to revolt against the high taxes of the palace. Archaeology shows that around 1200 BC, many Mycenaean sites were destroyed by fire. But unlike previous destructions, they were not rebuilt. The survivors fled into the mountains or across the sea to Cyprus. The most tragic loss was the art of writing. The Mycenaeans used a script called Linear B to keep their palace records. It was a complex system used only by a tiny elite of scribes. When the palaces were burned and the scribes were killed or scattered, the knowledge of how to read and write Linear B died with them. Greece entered a dark age that would last for 400 years. The stories of the great kings, Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus, would only survive as oral poems, passed down through the generations until they were finally written down by Homer centuries later. Egypt's last stand, the Battle of the Delta. By 1175 BC, only one great power remained, Egypt. Pharaoh Ramesses III knew that the tidal wave was coming for him. The Sea Peoples had already destroyed the Hittites and the Levant. Egypt was the final prize. Ramesses III was a brilliant tactician. He realized that he could not win a traditional battle against a migrating nation. He had to use the geography of the Nile against them. The Sea Peoples arrived both by land and by sea. Their fleet, filled with warriors wearing feathered headdresses and carrying straight-edged swords, entered the mouths of the Nile. They expected a naval battle in the open water, where their superior sailing skills would give them the advantage. Instead, Ramesses III lured them into the narrow, shallow channels of the delta. Hidden behind the high reeds and the mudbanks, thousands of Egyptian archers waited. As the Sea People's ships became entangled in the narrow waterways, Ramesses gave the order. A relentless storm of arrows rained down on the invaders. The Sea Peoples, trapped on their crowded decks, had nowhere to hide. On the banks, the Egyptian infantry charged, using grappling hooks to pull the enemy ships to the shore. It was a slaughter. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict the aftermath with gruesome detail. The Sea People's ships capsized, their warriors drowning, and thousands of prisoners led away in chains. Egypt had won. It had survived the storm that drowned the rest of the world. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Egypt was exhausted. Its gold mines were empty, its trade partners were gone, and its prestige was shattered. The new kingdom of Egypt would linger on for a few more centuries, but it would never again be the undisputed superpower of the world. The silence of the Dark Ages. As the smoke cleared from the Battle of the Delta, a new reality emerged. The world of the great kings was dead. The international trade that had defined the Bronze Age had evaporated. In its place was a fragmented, local, and much poorer world. In Greece, the population plummeted. The great citadels became haunted ruins. People moved into small, isolated villages, and the sophisticated art and architecture of the Mycenaeans were forgotten. In Anatolia, the Phrygians and other tribes moved into the vacuum left by the Hittites. In the Levant, the destruction of the old Canaanite cities allowed new groups to emerge. The Phoenicians, the Israelites, and the Philistines, who were likely the descendants of the Peleset tribe of the Sea Peoples. This was the Great Reset. The collapse was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. Millions died from famine, war, and disease. But it was also a necessary clearing of the ground. The old, rigid palace economies were too fragile to survive a changing world. Their destruction allowed for the birth of something new. With the supply of tin cut off, blacksmiths were forced to experiment with a common but difficult metal, iron. Iron required much higher temperatures to forge, but once the technology was mastered, it changed everything. Unlike bronze, which was a luxury for the elite, iron was everywhere. It democratized warfare and agriculture. The Iron Age was the era of the common man, and it began in the ashes of the Bronze Age. The anatomy of empire. The scribes of the sun. To understand why the collapse was so devastating, one must understand the sheer complexity of the world that died. This was not a world of simple farmers. It was a world of paperless paperwork. In the dusty archives of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, and in the House of Life in Egyptian Thebes, thousands of scribes spent their entire lives recording the heartbeat of the world. They wrote on clay tablets, on papyrus, and on waxed wooden boards. They were the hard drives of the Bronze Age. The education of a scribe began in childhood. They had to master hundreds of cuneiform signs or hieroglyphic symbols. They were taught that they were the elite, the only ones who could communicate across time and distance. A famous Egyptian text, the Satire of the Trades, exhorted students to stay in school, claiming that every other job, the blacksmith, the farmer, the soldier, was a life of misery compared to the scribe who directs the work of all men. These scribes did more than just count grain. They managed the brotherhood of kings. When we look at the Amarna letters, we see the scribes' work in action. These tablets, written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the day, show a world of intense diplomatic protocol. Kings did not just send messages, they sent negotiators. If a king of Babylon sent a gift of gold that was slightly underweight, the Egyptian scribes would catch it. The resulting diplomatic row could last for years, with frantic letters flying back and forth across the desert. "Why did my brother send me gold that is not pure?" one king asks. "Am I not a great king? Do I not deserve the finest?" This petty bickering reveals a world that was incredibly stable, so stable that kings could afford to argue over the purity of gold for a decade. The Tin Road and the Uluburan mystery. The true lifeblood of this era was the trade route. To see this world in its full glory, we must look beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, off the coast of modern-day Turkey. In 1982, a sponge diver discovered the Uluburan shipwreck. This single ship, which sank around 1300 BC, is a time capsule of the late Bronze Age economy. On board were 10 tons of copper from Cyprus and 1 ton of tin, the exact 10:1 ratio needed to create bronze. But the cargo didn't stop there. There were jars of terebinth resin from the Levant, ebony from Africa, elephant and hippopotamus tusks, tortoise shells, and over 150 glass ingots of cobalt blue and turquoise. There was jewelry from Egypt, including a gold scarab bearing the name of Queen Nefertiti. This ship was a microcosm of the globalized world. It carried goods from at least 7 different cultures. It tells us that the great powers were not isolated islands. They were organs in a single living body. If the heart trade stopped beating, the limbs, the empires, would wither. This ship also reveals the extreme vulnerability of the system. A single storm, a single pirate raid, or a single closed port could disrupt the production of bronze for an entire kingdom. The wealth of the Bronze Age was built on just-in-time delivery. There were no massive stockpiles of tin. Everything was in transit. The Hittite fortress, a giant with clay feet. In the center of this web sat the Hittite Empire. While Egypt was a land of river and sun, the land of Hatti was a rugged, mountainous plateau. The Hittites were the masters of iron working, though they kept it a closely guarded state secret, and chariot warfare. Their capital, Hattusa, was a masterpiece of military engineering. It was surrounded by miles of massive stone walls, with secret tunnels called posterns that allowed soldiers to launch surprise counterattacks against besiegers. The Hittite king was not a god king like the pharaoh. He was a great king who ruled through a complex system of vassalage. He signed treaties with smaller kingdoms, Troy, Wilusa, Arzawa, and the city-states of Syria. These treaties were incredibly detailed, specifying exactly how many troops a vassal had to provide and what happened if they failed. The Hittites were the lawyers of the ancient world. But the Hittite Empire was geographically cursed. It was surrounded by enemies. To the north were the Kaska, fierce mountain tribes who launched seasonal raids. To the west were the Ahiyawa, the Mycenaean Greeks, who were constantly stirring up rebellion. To the east was the rising power of Assyria. The Hittites had to maintain a massive standing army just to keep their borders secure. This required a constant flow of grain and metal. When the drought began to dry up the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite legal system and military machine began to grind to a halt. You cannot enforce a treaty with a starving vassal. The Mycenaean lion, heroes of the Aegean. Across the sea to the west lay the world of the Mycenaeans. These were the Achaeans of Homer's Iliad. They lived in high-walled citadels like Mycenae, Turins, and Pylos. Their culture was obsessed with status and war. We see this in their grave circles, where kings were buried with gold masks and bronze swords inlaid with scenes of lion hunts. The Mycenaeans were the newcomers to the Great Powers Club. They were aggressive sailors and traders. They established colonies as far away as Sicily and the coast of Spain. Their palaces were centers of intense industry. In the palace of Pylos, scribes recorded the work of hundreds of women who spun wool and wove textiles for export. They recorded the exact amount of bronze given to blacksmiths to make spearheads. But the Mycenaean world was top-heavy. The Wanax, king, sat at the top of a massive pyramid of bureaucrats. Beneath them were the Lauichtas, military leaders, and the Telestai, landowners. The common people were essentially serfs, tied to the palace's redistributive system. This meant that the entire Greek world was dependent on the palace functioning correctly. If the king could not protect the trade routes, he could not pay the craftsmen. If he could not pay the craftsmen, he could not maintain the fleet. By 1220 BC, the Mycenaeans were clearly nervous. At Mycenae, they expanded their walls to include a secret cistern that led to a deep underground spring, a sign they were preparing for long sieges. At the Isthmus of Corinth, they began building a massive wall to block invaders from the north. They knew something was coming. They could see the smoke on the horizon. The Egyptian superpower, the Ramesside era. Egypt was the anchor of the world. Under the long reign of Rameses II, Rameses the Great, Egypt had reached its cultural and military zenith. Rameses II was a master of propaganda. He covered the walls of his temples, from Karnak to Abu Simbel, with accounts of his victory at the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. In reality, the battle was a stalemate that led to the world's first recorded peace treaty. Under Rameses and his successor Merneptah, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. The annual flooding of the Nile provided a surplus of grain that no other nation could match. This grain was Egypt's greatest weapon. It used food to buy the loyalty of neighbors and to sustain the Hittites during their famine. But even Egypt was changing. The population was becoming increasingly diverse. The Egyptian army was no longer composed only of Egyptians. It was filled with foreign mercenaries. There were Libyans, Nubians, and even a group called the Shardana, warriors from the north who wore horned helmets and carried long, straight swords. These Shardana were the first of the sea peoples to appear in history. Initially, they came as enemies, but the Egyptians were so impressed by their fighting skill that they hired them as the pharaoh's personal bodyguard. This was a dangerous game. Egypt was importing the very people who would eventually bring the system down. As the 13th century BC drew to a close, the Egyptian state was becoming a hollow shell. The bureaucracy was corrupt, the priesthood was becoming more powerful than the pharaoh, and the borders were becoming porous. The first tremors, internal unrest. Before the Sea Peoples ever landed, the Bronze Age empires were already rotting from within. We see signs of social collapse in the records. In Egypt, we have the first recorded labor strike in history. During the reign of Rameses III, the tomb builders at Deir el-Medina walked off the job because their grain rations had not been delivered. "We are hungry," they shouted at the officials. "The month has passed and we have nothing." In the Levant, the records of Ugarit speak of Apuru, displaced people, outlaws, and runaway slaves who lived in the hills and launched raids on the trade caravans. These were not foreign invaders. These were the victims of the palace economy, people who had been pushed out of society by debt and famine. As the drought worsened, these internal pressures reached a boiling point. The peasants, who had for centuries faithfully brought their harvest to the palace, began to realize that the palace could no longer protect them. In city after city, we find evidence of internal destruction. Archaeology shows that in some places, the palaces were burned, but the surrounding villages were left untouched. This suggests that the people had risen up and burned the tax records and the bureaucracies that enslaved them. The world was a tinderbox. The climate was the heat, the famine was the fuel, and the sea peoples were merely the spark. The shaking of the earth. While the drought was a silent, invisible killer that withered the crops and emptied the granaries over decades, another force was waiting to deliver a much more violent blow. To the people of the late Bronze Age, the earth was not a solid, reliable foundation. It was a living, breathing entity, often associated with the wrath of the gods. In Greece, it was Poseidon, the earth shaker. In the Levant, it was Baal, the storm god who could make the mountains tremble. Between 1225 and 1175 BC, these gods seem to have declared war on humanity. Geological research led by scientists like Amos Nur has identified a phenomenon known as an earthquake storm. In most cases, an earthquake is an isolated event, but along major fault lines, like the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey or the Dead Sea Transform, the release of pressure in one segment can put immense stress on the next segment, triggering a slow-motion sequence of massive tremors that can last for 50 years. Archaeology reveals a terrifying pattern of destruction during this half-century. At Mycenae, Turin, and Troy, we find walls that have been shifted off their foundations, skeletons trapped under fallen masonry, and characteristic tilting of stone structures that can only be caused by seismic activity. At the site of Turin in the Peloponnese, the destruction was so severe that the survivors did not even attempt to clear the rubble from the old palace. They simply built small, pathetic mud brick hovels on top of the ruins of their ancestors' glory. This was the 1-2 punch. The drought had already weakened the social fabric. The peasants were already hungry. The armies were already stretched thin. When the earthquake struck, they didn't just knock down walls, they shattered the myth of the king's divinity. If the king was the chosen representative of the gods, why were the gods literally pulling his palace into the earth? In the wake of the tremors, fire almost always followed. Cooking hearths were overturned, lamps were dropped, and the timber-framed roofs of the great halls became funeral pyres for the Bronze Age elite. Alatia, the island of copper. To see the collapse of the global supply chain, one must look at Cyprus, known in ancient texts as Alatia. In the 13th century BC, Cyprus was the gas station of the Mediterranean. It was the world's primary source of copper. Without Alatia, there was no bronze. Because of this, the island was a neutral ground of sorts, a place where all the great powers traded. It was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and seemingly secure. The letters found in the archives of Ugarit and Egypt reveal a frantic correspondence between the king of Alatia and his neighbors as the crisis deepened. The king of Alatia was one of the first to spot the sea peoples on the horizon. He sent warnings to the king of Ugarit, describing strange ships that did not belong to any known kingdom. But soon, the tables turned. The enemy landed on Cyprus first. The archaeological record on Cyprus shows a sudden transition. Rich, unfortified coastal cities like Nkomi and Hala Sultan Tek were suddenly abandoned or fortified with massive walls. We find hoards, treasures of gold and bronze tools buried under floors by people who hoped to return and dig them up once the danger passed. They never did. The fall of Alatia was the final nail in the coffin for the Bronze Age. Once the copper mines were seized or the trade routes from the island were cut, the bronze web was severed. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Canaanites were now fighting with dwindling resources. They were using old, chipped swords because they could no longer forge new ones. The high-tech warfare of the chariot era was over. The age of the desperate infantryman had begun. Who were the Sea Peoples? The identity mystery. For centuries, historians looked for a single homeland for the Sea Peoples. They searched for a lost kingdom that had launched a massive invasion. But modern scholarship suggests a much more complex and tragic reality. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation. They were a chain reaction of displaced ethnicities. Consider the tribes named in the Egyptian records: There are the Peliset, who are almost certainly the Philistines. They are depicted with distinct feathered headdresses and straight-edged iron or bronze swords. There are the Shurden, who had been seen in the Mediterranean for decades as pirates and mercenaries. Many scholars link them to the island of Sardinia, suggesting a Western Mediterranean origin. Then there are the Shekelesh, often linked to Sicily, and the Lucca, a notorious group of pirates from the coast of Lycia in modern-day Turkey. The Sea Peoples were a coalition of the displaced. Imagine a domino effect. The drought in Central Europe and the Balkans pushes northern tribes south into Greece. The Mycenaean Greeks, their palaces already crumbling from earthquakes and famine, take to their ships and flee towards Cyprus and the Levant. On their way, they pick up other groups, disenfranchised mercenaries, mountain tribes, and pirates. By the time they reached the shores of Egypt, this was a multicultural armada. They were not just warriors, they were families. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show the Sea Peoples traveling with heavy ox carts filled with women, children, and household goods. This was a migration of despair. They were not looking for tribute or gold. They were looking for a place where the rain still fell and the soil was still fertile. This made them far more dangerous than a traditional army. You can negotiate with a king, but you cannot negotiate with 1,000,000 people who are starving to death. The collapse of the Levant. As the Sea Peoples moved down the coast of the Levant, the great city-states of Canaan fell like dominoes. This was the most urbanized part of the ancient world, a string of wealthy ports and inland fortresses that had thrived for 1,000 years. The destruction of Ugarit remains the most vivid example of the end. Ugarit was the New York City of its day, a hub of literature, law, and commerce. Archaeologists found a letter in the house of a high-ranking official named Rapanu. It was a message from the king of Cyprus, warning that the enemy ships were already seen on the coast. But the response from the king of Ugarit was one of total helplessness. He had sent his army to the north to help the Hittites and his fleet to the west to guard the Lycian coast. His city was defenseless. When the attack came, it was total. Ugarit was burned so thoroughly that it was never inhabited again. The city simply disappeared from history until it was rediscovered in 1928. Further south, the same story repeated. Hazor, the largest city in Canaan, was destroyed. Its statues of gods and kings were deliberately decapitated, a sign of a population rising up in anger against its failed leaders. Megiddo, Lachish, and Ashkelon were all put to the torch. In the ruins of these cities, we find a stratigraphic break, a thick layer of ash and charcoal that separates the wealthy, cosmopolitan Bronze Age from the poor, fragmented Iron Age that followed. Below the ash, we find imported pottery from Greece and gold from Egypt. Above the ash, we find only crude, locally made pots and the remains of simple huts. The world had shrunk. The great powers had been replaced by small survivors. Complexity theory: why the world broke. Why did the entire system fail so completely? Why couldn't one of the empires, like Egypt or Assyria, step in and restore order? The answer lies in complexity theory. In a complex system, all the parts are interconnected. This interconnectedness is a strength during good times. It allows for specialized labor, massive trade, and rapid innovation. But it is a fatal weakness during a perfect storm. Historian Eric Klein describes this as a systemic collapse. Imagine a spider web. If you break one or two threads, the web stays up. But if you break the central anchor threads, the tin trade, the palace bureaucracy, the grain supply, the entire web collapses instantly. In 1200 BC, too many threads broke at once. Climate change, the drought. Natural disaster, the earthquakes. Internal rebellion, the peasant revolts. External invasion, the Sea Peoples. Economic collapse, the end of the bronze trade. The system had become too complex to manage. The overhead of running an empire, the cost of the scribes, the chariots, the palace rituals, outweighed the resources available. When the return on investment for being part of an empire became negative, people simply walked away. They became the Apuru, the outlaws. They became the Sea Peoples. They chose the chaos of the collapse over the slow starvation of the state. The Bronze Age did not just end. It committed suicide through its own sophistication. It was a victim of its own success, leaving behind a vacuum that would take 4 centuries to fill. The Last Stand of the Pharaohs and the Fragments of Faith. The Lion's Last Roar, Egypt's Tactical Gamble. By the year 1175 BC, the Mediterranean was no longer a highway of commerce, but a graveyard of empires. To the north, the Hittite capital of Hattusa was a smoking ruin. To the west, the Mycenaean palaces were silent, their gold masks buried beneath layers of ash. The Sea Peoples, that multinational armada of the displaced and the desperate, had moved through the Levant like a locust swarm. They had crushed the kingdoms of Amurru and Ugarit, and now they turned their bird-headed prows toward the only prize left, the Nile Delta. Pharaoh Ramesses III was not a man of peace. He lived in the shadow of his predecessor, Ramesses the Great, and he knew that his legitimacy depended on his ability to hold back the tide. But he faced a military problem that his ancestors never had to solve. Egypt's military was designed for chariot warfare on the open plains of Syria. Chariots were the tanks of the Bronze Age, fast, expensive, and devastating against disciplined infantry. However, the Sea Peoples did not fight like a state army. They fought as a mass of heavy infantry, protected by round shields and armed with long, straight-edged swords that could cleave through bronze armor. Ramesses III executed a two-front defense that would become the stuff of military legend. First, he met the land invasion at Egypt's eastern border. The Sea Peoples were moving in a massive caravan of ox carts, essentially a nation on wheels. Ramesses utilized his chariot corps not to charge the center, but to harass the flanks, funneling the slow-moving migration into killing zones, where his archers could pick them off from a distance. The land battle was a victory, but the true threat was still at sea. The Sea Peoples' fleet was composed of deep-water vessels, built for the rougher currents of the Aegean. They were higher and more stable than the flat-bottomed Egyptian river boats. Knowing he could not win a ship-to-ship boarding action in the open Mediterranean, Ramesses lured the invaders into the narrow, silt-heavy mouths of the Nile. On the banks, he concealed thousands of the finest archers in the world. As the invaders entered the river branches, they found the water too shallow and the space too cramped to maneuver. The Egyptian fleet, small but nimble, began to capsize the enemy ships with grappling hooks. At the same time, a literal black cloud of arrows descended from the reeds. The Sea Peoples, trapped on their own decks, were slaughtered. Thousands were led away in chains to labor in the mines of Nubia, while others were settled on the coast of Canaan, a strategic move that would backfire in the centuries to come. The Eastern Resilience, why Assyria did not break. While the Mediterranean was collapsing, the world further east, in Mesopotamia, experienced a different kind of trauma. The Middle Assyrian Empire and the Kingdom of Elam did not suffer the total annihilation seen in Greece or Anatolia. To understand why, we have to look at their geography and their systemic insulation. The Assyrians were a nation of hardened warriors and relentless administrators. Unlike the Mycenaeans, who were dependent on the Sea Peoples' highway, the Assyrians were a land power. Their trade routes ran east to west across the plains and north into the mountains of Urartu. When the Mediterranean trade collapsed, the Assyrians certainly felt the economic shock, but their palace economy was supported by a massive agricultural heartland irrigated by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These rivers were less sensitive to the Mediterranean Mega-Drought than the rain-fed fields of Greece. Furthermore, the Assyrians were already a highly militarized society. They were used to asymmetric warfare against the nomadic tribes of the desert and the hill people of the Zagros Mountains. When the chaos of the 12th century began, the Assyrians simply pulled back their borders, fortified their core cities like Ashur and Nineveh, and waited. They transitioned from an expansionist empire to a fortress state. They survived, but they became more insular, more paranoid, and more brutal, traits that would define the Neo-Assyrian Empire that would eventually rise from the ashes to conquer the entire Middle East. The Phoenix of the Levant, the rise of the Phoenicians. As the smoke cleared from the burning of the Canaanite city-states, a vacuum emerged. The great powers, Egypt and the Hittites, had previously controlled every port and every trade route in the Levant. With the Hittites gone and Egypt retreating to the Nile, the coastal cities that had managed to survive or were quickly rebuilt found themselves in a unique position. They were free. The most important of these were the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. We know these people today as the Phoenicians, though they called themselves Canaanites. They were the ultimate opportunists of the collapse. They realized that while the great kings were gone, the demand for luxury goods was not. The world still wanted purple dye, cedar wood, and fine metalwork. The Phoenicians redesigned the concept of the empire. They didn't want to conquer land. They wanted to conquer markets. They took the old Bronze Age sailing techniques and improved them, building ships that could sail at night by following the North Star, which the Greeks later called the Phoenician Star. Because they no longer had to pay tribute to a pharaoh or a Hittite king, their wealth skyrocketed. They became the middlemen of the early Iron Age, connecting the fractured pieces of the post-collapse world. Most importantly, to manage their vast trading empire, they simplified the complex writing systems of the past into a 22-letter alphabet. It was a tool of the merchant, not the palace scribe, and it would eventually change the world forever. The wilderness and the covenant, the emergence of Israel. While the Phoenicians took to the sea, a different kind of transformation was happening in the rugged highlands of Canaan. In the wake of the collapse of the Egyptian-controlled city-state system, a new group of people began to appear in the archaeological record. They didn't build grand palaces or massive fortifications. They built small, egalitarian villages in the hills. These were the early Israelites. The question of their origin is one of the most debated topics in history. Some scholars believe they were part of the Sea People's wave, while others suggest they were the Apuru, the runaway slaves and displaced peasants who had fled the crumbling Bronze Age cities. Archaeology shows a sudden explosion of these hill country settlements around 1200–1150 BC. Their material culture was distinct. They avoided pork, a dietary taboo that stood in stark contrast to the Philistine cities on the coast. They lacked the social hierarchy of the Bronze Age. Their houses were roughly the same size, suggesting a tribal society that rejected the god-king model of Egypt. In the vacuum left by the collapse, these people forged a new identity based not on the power of a palace, but on a shared covenant and a common history of liberation from the old world order. The collapse of the Bronze Age was, for them, the necessary exodus that allowed for the birth of a nation. The Philistine Pentapolis, the sea people who stayed. What happened to the sea peoples who weren't slaughtered by Ramesses III? The Egyptian records tell us they were settled in the southern Levant. In reality, they likely seized the land. The Peliset tribe established a confederation of 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These became the Philistines. Unlike the Israelites in the hills, the Philistines remained a sophisticated urban maritime culture. They brought with them the technology of the Aegean-style pottery, hearths in the center of their rooms, a Mycenaean feature, and most importantly, advanced metalworking. For a long time, the Philistines held a monopoly on iron in the region. The Bible records that no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, because the Philistines wanted to prevent the hill people from making swords and spears. The Philistines are the living ghost of the Bronze Age. They represent the fusion of the old Mycenaean world with the local Canaanite culture. Their presence created a frontier environment, a constant state of friction between the coastal Iron Age cities and the highland tribes that would eventually give rise to the kingdom of David and Solomon. The democratization of metal, the Iron Revolution. As we move further into the 11th century BC, the Great Unraveling begins to slow down, and a great rebuilding begins. The defining feature of this new era was not a king or a temple, but a common black metal, iron. Bronze was the metal of the elite. It required a global network to produce. When the network died, the elite died. But iron was different. Iron ore is found almost everywhere, in the mountains, in the swamps, and in the deserts. The problem was that iron required a much higher temperature to smelt and a new process called carburization to make it as strong as bronze. The collapse forced the blacksmiths of the Mediterranean to innovate. With no tin coming from the east, they had to make iron work. Once they did, the balance of power shifted. A farmer could now afford an iron plowshare, which allowed him to break tougher soil and grow more food. A common soldier could afford an iron spear. The palace economy was replaced by a market economy. The monopoly of the great kings was over. The Iron Age was the age of the individual, the small kingdom, and the alphabet. The world was darker, poorer, and more violent than the Golden Bronze Age, but it was also more resilient. The foundation was being laid for the rise of Greece, Rome, and the modern world. The Greek Dark Ages, the silence of the Heroes. The Great Silence. When the smoke finally cleared from the ruins of Mycenaean and Turins around 1150 BC, a terrifying silence fell over the Aegean. For nearly 500 years, the Greek mainland had been a hive of industry, governed by a complex, rigid hierarchy of kings and scribes. Now, the palaces were hollow shells of scorched stone. The paved roads that once connected the great citadels were reclaimed by thorns. The massive, cyclopean walls, which the Greeks of later centuries would believe were built by giants, stood as monuments to a forgotten world. This period, stretching from roughly 1100 to 800 BC, is known to historians as the Greek Dark Ages. It is dark not because the people were necessarily more primitive or miserable than their ancestors, though they were certainly poorer, but because the light of history went out. The record ceased. The bureaucracy evaporated. In the Bronze Age, we have the names of officials, the inventories of chariot wheels, and the counts of sheep. In the Dark Ages, we have nothing but the silent testimony of broken pots and shallow graves. The collapse of the Mycenaean world was not just a political event. It was a demographic catastrophe. It is estimated that the population of the Greek mainland plummeted by as much as 75 to 90% in some regions. Large tracts of fertile land were abandoned. The great urban centers, which once supported thousands of residents, were replaced by tiny, isolated hamlets consisting of a few dozen people. These survivors lived in mud brick huts with thatched roofs, structures so flimsy they left almost no trace for modern archaeologists to find. The death of the word, why linear B vanished. Perhaps the most striking feature of the Greek Dark Ages is the total loss of literacy. The Mycenaeans had developed a script called Linear B, a complex system of over 80 signs representing syllables. But Linear B was never a literary script. It was never used to write poems, histories, or laws. It was a tool for bean counters. In the Bronze Age, writing belonged exclusively to the palace. Scribes used it to track the redistribution of grain, the allocation of bronze to blacksmiths, and the sacrificial offerings to the gods. It was a language of the state. When the palaces were burned, the state died, and with it, the only reason for Linear B to exist. There were no schools, no books, and no private letters. Within a single generation, the ability to read and write vanished from the Greek world. For the next 400 years, the Greeks lived in an entirely oral culture. The memories of the Age of Heroes, the wars of Troy, and the glory of Mycenae were kept alive by traveling bards who sang epic poems to the accompaniment of a lyre. Because these stories were not written down, they morphed and changed over the centuries. Historical kings were transformed into the sons of gods. Actual military logistics were replaced by divine intervention. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which would eventually be written down at the end of the Dark Ages, are the echoes of this long silence, a distorted, beautiful memory of a world that had actually existed, but which the Dark Age Greeks could no longer truly understand. the Dorian invasion, myth versus reality. For a long time, historians believed the collapse of the Mycenaeans was caused by a sudden invasion from the north by a tribe called the Dorians. This Dorian invasion was a foundational myth for the later Spartans, who claimed to be the descendants of these northern conquerors. They believed the Dorians arrived with iron weapons and swept away the bronze-shielded Mycenaeans in a whirlwind of fire. However, modern archaeology tells a different, more nuanced story. There is no clear evidence of a massive, external invasion layer across Greece. Instead, it seems the Mycenaean system collapsed from within, crippled by the systemic collapse of drought, famine, and peasant revolts. The Dorians were likely not invaders from a foreign land, but a Greek-speaking group from the fringes of the Mycenaean world who simply moved into the vacuum left by the fallen kings. They weren't conquerors, they were squatters in the ruins of a better world. The transition was slow and messy. In some places, like the city of Athens, the Mycenaean culture seems to have lingered longer, as the city's high citadel was never fully sacked. In other places, like the Peloponnese, the old world was completely erased, replaced by the simpler, more egalitarian tribal structures of the newcomers. The Lefkandi centaur and the rise of the big men. If the palaces were gone, who ruled the Dark Age Greeks? The answer lies in the archaeological site of Lefkandi on the island of Euboea. In the 1980s, archaeologists discovered a massive building, nearly 50 meters long, dating to about 950 BC. This was the heroine of Lefkandi. Inside, they found the grave of a man and a woman. The man had been cremated and placed in a bronze urn from Cyprus, an heirloom already centuries old when he died. The woman was buried with gold jewelry and a dagger with an ivory hilt. Next to them were the skeletons of 4 horses. This was not the burial of a simple peasant. It was the burial of a basileus, a big man or local chieftain. The Lefkandi site proves that even in the Dark Ages, some level of wealth and hierarchy survived. These basileus were not like the Mycenaean kings. They didn't have bureaucracies or scribes. They ruled through personal charisma, military prowess, and the ability to host great feasts. They were the kings described in the poems of Homer, men who worked their own fields and fought in the front lines of battle alongside their followers. This was the birth of a new kind of leadership, one based on merit and wealth rather than the divine right of a palace system. The Ionian migration, fleeing to the east. As the Greek mainland became increasingly unstable, a massive movement of people began. This is known as the Ionian migration. Families from Athens, the Peloponnese, and Euboea took to their ships and sailed across the Aegean to the western coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They established a string of new cities, Miletus, Ephesus, and Samos, on the very land that the Hittite Empire had once controlled. These settlers were the refugees of the collapse. By moving to the coast of Asia Minor, they stayed in contact with the surviving civilizations of the East, such as the Neo-Hittites and the rising Phrygians. This migration was crucial for the eventual recovery of Greece. While the mainland remained isolated and poor, the Ionian Greeks became the bridge between the old world of the East and the new world of the West. They were the first to encounter the Phoenician alphabet and the first to begin the philosophical inquiries that would later define Greek thought. The collapse had pushed the Greeks out of their isolation and forced them to become a maritime people, a change that would eventually lead to the rise of the Athenian Empire. The geometric revolution. While the Dark Ages were a time of material poverty, they were also a time of intense artistic experimentation. Without the rigid traditions of the palaces to guide them, Greek potters began to develop a new style. Instead of the flowing, naturalistic scenes of the Bronze Age, octopuses, bulls, and lilies, Dark Age pottery was defined by the geometric style. It was a world of straight lines, zigzags, and repeating patterns. It was disciplined, mathematical, and stark. Eventually, around 800 BC, tiny, stylized human figures began to reappear on the pots, usually in scenes of funerals or battles. This shift in art reflected a shift in the Greek mind. The chaos of the collapse had been replaced by a desire for order, structure, and symmetry. The Greeks were rebuilding their world from the ground up, using the simplest building blocks of design. The end of the long night. By 800 BC, the Dark Ages were beginning to break. The population was growing again. Trade with the Phoenicians had resumed, bringing not just luxury goods but a new technology, the alphabet. The Greeks took the Phoenician letters and added vowels, creating the first truly phonetic writing system in history. The silence was over. The Greeks began to write down the songs of the bards. They began to build the first stone temples to their gods. They founded the Olympic Games. The great unraveling had finally reached its end, and the archaic period had begun. The world that emerged was unrecognizable to a Mycenaean king. It was a world of city-states polis, of citizen soldiers, and of the alphabet. It was a world born from the ashes of the Bronze Age, forged in the fire of the collapse, and strengthened by 400 years of silence. The Anatolian vacuum, Phonix in the ASHES. The ghost of Hadusa. While Greece fell into a 400-year silence, the heart of modern-day Turkey, the Anatolian plateau, witnessed a different kind of transformation. In 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire was a superpower that rivaled Egypt. Its capital, Hadusa, was a sprawling fortress of stone and mystery, perched on a jagged ridge and protected by miles of massive walls. Then, almost overnight, the great king was gone. For decades, historians assumed that the Sea Peoples had swept across the plateau like a wildfire, sacking Hadusa and slaughtering its inhabitants. But modern archaeology tells a much more eerie story. When archaeologists excavated the royal citadel of Hadusa, they found something unexpected. There were fires, yes, but many of the official buildings, the temples and the archives, had been emptied before they burned. The royal family and the high officials hadn't been trapped. They had packed up their records, their gold, and their holy icons, and they had simply walked away. Hadusa wasn't a victim of a sudden blitzkrieg. It was the victim of a systemic heart attack. The great unraveling had cut the grain shipments from the coast. The drought had turned the Anatolian wheat fields into dust. The king, unable to feed his court or his army, abandoned his capital to the elements. The empire of the 1,000 gods simply evaporated, leaving behind a massive vacuum in the center of the world. The Neo-Hittite survival, the flame in the south. But the Hittite culture did not die. While the central plateau became a wilderness, the southern and eastern fringes of the empire, territories in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, survived. Here, in cities like Carchemish, Melid, and Samil, the survivors of the Hittite collapse established a series of Neo-Hittite city-states. These were the successor states of the Bronze Age. The rulers of Carchemish even claimed the title of Great King, asserting that they were the true heirs to the throne of Hadusa. They continued to use hieroglyphic Luwian, a beautiful script of birds, hands, and solar discs, long after cuneiform had faded from the region. These city-states became the museums of the Bronze Age. They preserved the art, the religion, and the military traditions of their ancestors. For 500 years, they stood as a bridge between the Old World and the rising powers of the Iron Age. They were the ones who taught the Greeks and the Phoenicians about the myths of the East, and they provided the aesthetic template for the monumental architecture that would eventually influence the Assyrians. They prove that civilization is rarely wiped out entirely. It simply migrates to where the water still flows and the trade still lives. The arrival of the Phrygians, the Mushki tide. While the Neo-Hittites were clinging to the past in the south, a new people were moving into the empty heart of Anatolia. They came from the northwest, likely the Balkans, and they are known in the Assyrian records as the Mushki. To the Greeks, they were the Phrygians. The Phrygians were the new blood of the Iron Age. They were not builders of massive stone fortresses. Initially, they were nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes, but as they settled in the ruins of the Hittite world, they established a capital at Gordion, located on the banks of the Sangarios River. The Phrygians represent the quintessential Iron Age transition. They took the agricultural foundations of Anatolia and added a new, vibrant cultural layer. They are famous for their intricate textiles, their unique geometric pottery, and their incredible wooden furniture, which was prized throughout the ancient world. Most importantly, they brought a new spirit of individualism. The Phrygian state was less of a rigid bureaucracy and more of a confederation of powerful landowners and merchants. The myth and reality of King Midas. No name is more synonymous with Phrygia than Midas. In Greek mythology, he was the king with the golden touch, a man so wealthy that even his food turned to gold. While the myth is a fable about greed, archaeology has revealed that Midas was a very real and very powerful historical figure. In the late 8th century BC, the Assyrian king Sargon II wrote of a man named Meda of Mushki. This was the historical Midas. He was a master diplomat who played the great powers against each other. Under his rule, Phrygia became the dominant power in Anatolia. In 1957, archaeologists at Gordion excavated a massive burial mound known as the Tumulus, Midas Mound. Inside a mountain of earth, they found a perfectly preserved log cabin made of cedar and juniper. Inside was the body of a man in his 60s, lying on a bed of luxury textiles. He wasn't covered in gold. Instead, he was surrounded by the finest bronze vessels and elaborate wooden tables of the era. The golden touch was likely a Greek metaphor for the incredible wealth Phrygia generated through trade and agriculture. The Lydian frontier, the invention of value. To the west of the Phrygians, along the fertile valleys of the Aegean coast, another group emerged from the ashes, the Lydians. Based in their capital of Sardis, the Lydians were the ultimate bridge builders. They sat exactly halfway between the Greek cities of the coast and the inland empires of the east. The Lydians were the first to truly master the new market economy of the Iron Age. While the Bronze Age had relied on the palace to redistribute wealth, the Lydians realized that trade was more efficient if people had a universal medium of exchange. In the 7th century BC, they began minting the world's first true coins, pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, stamped with the head of a lion. This invention was the final death blow to the old Bronze Age system. Once value was democratized through coinage, the power of the palace scribes was gone forever. Wealth was now mobile. It could be hidden, traded, and moved across borders with ease. The Lydians became fabulously wealthy, giving rise to the expression rich as Croesus. But more importantly, they fueled the Ionian Enlightenment by providing the capital that allowed Greek philosophers and scientists to pursue their work. The Luwian legacy, a forgotten language. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Anatolian vacuum is the survival of the Luwian language. For a long time, historians focused only on the Hittites, who spoke a related but distinct language. But as the empire fell, it became clear that Luwian was actually the language of the common people across western and southern Anatolia. In the wake of 1200 BC, while the official Hittite language died with the palace, Luwian thrived. It became the dominant language of the Neo-Hittite states and likely influenced the Phrygian and Lydian tongues. Some scholars even suggest that the legendary Troy, Wilusa, was a Luwian-speaking city. The survival of Luwian shows that cultural identity is often far more resilient than the states that claim to represent it. Even as the great kings fell, the people continued to speak their mother tongue, tell their stories, and worship their local gods. The Great Synthesis. The Anatolian Plateau from 1200 to 700 BC was a laboratory of human civilization. It was a place where the rubble of a fallen superpower provided the building blocks for a more flexible, more entrepreneurial world. The Phrygians brought the energy of the north, The Neo-Hittites preserved the wisdom of the South, and the Lydians invented the economy of the future. The vacuum was never truly empty. It was simply waiting for the next act in the human story. The collapse of the Bronze Age had swept away the stagnant, top-heavy empires of the past, making room for the rise of the Iron Age kingdoms that would eventually define the classical world. The Iron Will of Assyria, the birth of the war machine. The bastion in the east. While the Mediterranean was being swallowed by the great unraveling, and while the Greek palaces were falling into a silent dark age, a different story was unfolding in the heart of Mesopotamia. To understand why the world did not descend into total, universal chaos, we must look to the Tigris River. Here, the Middle Assyrian Empire stood as a grim, fortified bastion against the rising tide of the collapse. The Assyrians were a people forged by geography. Unlike Egypt, which was protected by vast deserts, or the Hittites, who were shielded by mountain ranges, Assyria sat on an open, vulnerable plain. They were surrounded by enemies, the mountain tribes of the north, the nomadic raiders of the west, and the ancient power of Babylon to the south. For the Assyrians, survival was not a given, it was a daily struggle. This constant pressure created a culture that was uniquely resilient, highly militarized, and intensely focused on the survival of the state. When the 12th century BC crisis began, the Assyrians did not collapse. Instead, they hardened. While other empires were dissolving into a mess of refugee migrations and internal revolts, the Assyrians turned their entire society into a machine designed for one purpose: the preservation of the order of Ashur. The Aramean Tide, the land-based sea peoples. The sea peoples were a maritime phenomenon, but the Bronze Age collapse also had a terrestrial equivalent. In the vast deserts of the Syrian steppe, a group of Semitic-speaking nomads known as the Arameans began to move. Driven by the same Mega-Drought that was starving the Hittites and the Greeks, the Arameans were pushed out of the deep desert and toward the fertile river valleys. To the Assyrians, the Arameans were a terrifying, invisible foe. They did not fight in large, pitched battles. They operated as raiding parties, cutting trade routes, burning isolated villages, and disappearing back into the dust before the heavy Assyrian chariots could catch them. For nearly a century, the Assyrian kings recorded a desperate struggle to keep the Arameans at bay. The Aramean pressure was so intense that it actually forced the Assyrian Empire to shrink. They abandoned their outlying provinces and retreated into their triangular heartland, the area between the cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela. This retreat was not a defeat, but a tactical consolidation. Within this triangle, the Assyrians perfected a new way of life. They built massive granaries, reinforced their city walls to unprecedented thicknesses, and began to reform their military. The military revolution, from chariots to iron. The Bronze Age was the era of the chariot. Chariots were the Ferraris of the ancient world, beautiful, expensive, and requiring a massive infrastructure of specialized horses, carpenters, and highly trained aristocratic Marianu warriors. But the collapse showed that chariots were fragile. They were useless in the mountains, they were vulnerable to guerrilla tactics, and they were impossible to maintain when the trade in tin and copper failed. The Assyrians were the first to realize that the future of warfare lay in the democratization of iron. They began to phase out the elite chariot corps in favor of massive, disciplined infantries, and eventually, the world's first true cavalry. Because iron was plentiful in the nearby mountains, the Assyrians could arm every single soldier with an iron-tipped spear, a reinforced shield, and an iron helmet. But it wasn't just the metal that changed, it was the tactics. The Assyrians invented the concept of total war. They developed the first professional corps of engineers who could build bridges, dig tunnels, and construct massive siege engines. They were the first to use the battering ram effectively, turning the once impregnable walls of the Bronze Age into rubble. While the sea peoples brought chaos, the Assyrians brought a terrifying, calculated order. The psychology of terror and the god of war. One of the most striking aspects of the Assyrian response to the collapse was their use of psychological warfare. In the Bronze Age, kings spoke to each other as brothers. There was a certain level of diplomatic politeness, even between enemies. The Assyrians threw that out the window. To prevent rebellions and to discourage the Aramean raiders, the Assyrian kings began to cover their palace walls with reliefs depicting the gruesome fate of those who resisted them. They recorded, in chilling detail, the flaying of rebel leaders, the impaling of enemies on stakes, and the mass deportation of entire populations. This was not just mindless cruelty, it was a state policy of calculated terror. The Assyrians believed that they were the instruments of their god, Ashur. In their worldview, the collapse of the world was a result of chaos and disorder. By conquering their neighbors and imposing their rule, they believed they were literally saving the world from entropy. This religious zeal gave them a cohesion that the dying empires of the West lacked. While the Mycenaean Greeks were losing the ability to read and write, the Assyrians were using their scribes to document their conquests with a cold, clinical precision. The economic pivot, plunder as a state system. As the international trade of the Bronze Age evaporated, the Assyrians developed a new economic model to replace it, the plunder economy. In the Old World, wealth was generated through the exchange of goods. In the new Assyrian world, wealth was generated through the extraction of tribute. Every year, the Assyrian army would march out on a campaign of the four quarters. They would strike a neighboring kingdom, seize its grain, its cattle, and its craftsmen, and bring them back to the heartland. This was a parasitic system, but it was incredibly effective at concentrating resources in a time of global scarcity. This system also led to the world's first mass deportations. When the Assyrians conquered a city, they didn't just loot it, they moved its people. They would take the elite of a conquered Aramean tribe and settle them in a different part of the empire, while moving Assyrian farmers into the newly conquered territory. This forced mixing of peoples shattered local identities and prevented organized resistance, but it also had an unintended side effect. It spread the Aramean language. Ironically, while the Assyrians were conquering the Arameans militarily, the Aramean language was conquering the Assyrian Empire culturally, eventually becoming the common tongue, lingua franca, of the entire Middle East. The bridge to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. By the end of the 11th century BC, the Great Unraveling had largely spent its force in the East. While Greece was still in the depths of its dark age, and Egypt was a shadow of its former self, Assyria emerged as the most powerful state on earth. They had survived the drought, they had withstood the Aramean migrations, and they had transformed their society into a permanent war machine. The Assyrians had provided the answer to the collapse. If the globalized system of trade fails, you replace it with a centralized system of force. This was a darker, more brutal world than the Golden Bronze Age, but it was a world that worked. It was the Assyrians who kept the light of civilization burning in Mesopotamia, preserving the ancient knowledge of the Sumerians and Babylonians through the worst of the storm. As we move into the next phase of history, we will see how this fortress state would eventually expand to become the first true world empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, setting the stage for the rise of the Persians, the Greeks of Alexander, and eventually the Romans. The collapse had not ended history, it had merely changed the rules of the game. The survivors, the Philistine Pentapolis and the Israelite highlands. The vacuum of the Levant. As the smoke cleared from the charred remains of Ugarit and the Egyptian garrisons retreated back to the safety of the Nile Delta, the Levant, the narrow strip of fertile land connecting Africa to Asia, became a land without a master. For 500 years, this region had been a chess board for the great kings. Now, the board was shattered. The royal governors were gone, the tax collectors were dead or in hiding, and the great city-states of Canaan had been reduced to a patchwork of smoking ruins and abandoned fields. But history does not tolerate a vacuum. In the wake of the Great Unraveling, two distinct groups of survivors emerged to claim the ruins. One came from the sea, armored in bronze and carrying the memories of the Aegean. The other emerged from the shadows of the hills, a disparate collection of outlaws, shepherds, and refugees. Their 200-year struggle for dominance would not just define the Iron Age Levant, it would create the cultural and religious foundation for much of Western civilization. The Paliset, the Sea Peoples Who Stayed. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu celebrate the total destruction of the Sea Peoples, but the archaeology tells a different story. While Ramesses III may have won the tactical battle in the Delta, he lost the strategic war for the Levant. The Paliset, one of the most prominent tribes of the Sea Peoples, did not vanish. Instead, they settled on the southern coast of Canaan, seizing a rich agricultural plain that would eventually bear their name, Palestine. They established a confederation of 5 powerful city-states known as the Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These were not the makeshift camps of refugees. These were sophisticated, planned urban centers. In the ruins of Ekron and Ashdod, archaeologists have found evidence of a culture that was radically different from anything that had existed in Canaan before. The Philistines brought the Aegean with them. They built houses with central hearths, a feature common in Mycenaean palaces but unheard of in the Levant. They produced a specific type of bichrome pottery, decorated with birds and geometric patterns that are nearly identical to the pottery found in late Bronze Age Cyprus and mainland Greece. Perhaps their greatest advantage was their technology. As graduates of the Bronze Age collapse, the Philistines were early masters of the iron forge. The Hebrew Bible notes that for a long time, the Philistines maintained a strict monopoly on metalworking, forcing the local tribes to come to them even to sharpen their farm tools. This was industrial imperialism. They controlled the means of production and the weapons of war, making them the undisputed heavyweight power of the 11th century BC. The Israelite emergence, the view from the hills. While the Philistines dominated the coast, a very different kind of society was coalescing in the rugged, limestone hills of the interior. For a long time, historians believed the Israelites arrived as a conquering army from the desert. However, modern archaeology suggests a more complex internal origin. As the Bronze Age palaces collapsed, the Puru, the displaced peasants, runaway slaves, and social outlaws who had lived on the fringes of Canaanite society, fled into the highlands where the Egyptian chariots could not follow. They were joined by segments of the Sea Peoples' migration, and perhaps small groups of nomadic tribes from the south. In the vacuum of the collapse, these nobodies of the Bronze Age forged a new, egalitarian identity. Between 1200 and 1000 BC, we see an explosion of small villages in the highlands of Samaria and Judea. These villages were distinct in several ways. The four-room house, a standardized architectural design that emphasized family units and domestic storage. The lack of pig bones. While Philistine sites are littered with pig remains, a staple of the Aegean diet, Israelite sites are almost entirely devoid of them. This dietary taboo became one of the first markers of a distinct Israelite ethnicity. The absence of luxury. There are no palaces, no temples to great kings, and very little imported gold. This was a counterculture that rejected the top-heavy, oppressive hierarchy of the Bronze Age empires. The geography of friction. The struggle between the Philistines and the Israelites was dictated by geography. The Philistines owned the international coastal highway and the fertile lowlands, which were perfect for their chariots and heavy infantry. The Israelites owned the high ground, which was easy to defend but difficult to farm. This created a permanent frontier. The biblical book of Judges is a collection of folk memories from this period, stories of saviors, or judges like Samson and Deborah, who led guerrilla raids against the technologically superior Philistines. It was a world of border zone tension. The Philistines wanted to push into the hills to control the trade routes to the east. The Israelites wanted to push into the valleys to escape the poverty of the highlands. This friction forced the Israelites to change. A loose confederation of tribes was no match for the organized, professional military of the Philistine Pentapolis. The archaeology of the late 11th century BC shows Israelite villages beginning to build walls and larger storehouses. The big men of the tribes were becoming kings. The threat of the Sea People's descendants was the evolutionary pressure that forced the birth of the Israelite monarchy. The religious shift, from gods of the state to the God of the covenant. The most profound legacy of this post-collapse struggle was not military but theological. In the Bronze Age, gods were national icons. If your city was conquered, it meant your god had been defeated by a stronger god. Religion was a transactional system handled by the king and the priesthood. But the survivors of the collapse, both the Philistines and the Israelites, had seen the great gods of the Bronze Age fail. The temples of Baal and Ra had burned just like the houses of the poor. In the Israelite highlands, a new concept emerged, the covenant. This was a religious treaty modeled not on the hierarchy of a palace, but on the loyalty of a tribe. Their god was not tied to a specific temple or a specific king. He was a god of history and justice who walked with his people in the wilderness. This portable and ethical religion was a direct response to the collapse of the state-centered religions of the Bronze Age. It was a faith built to survive the end of the world. The convergence. By 1000 BC, the Philistines and Israelites were no longer just invaders or refugees. They had become the new establishment. The Philistines had become canonized, adopting the local language and many local gods like Dagon, while keeping their Aegean military spirit. The Israelites had consolidated into a kingdom under Saul and David, finally developing the administrative tools and the iron weapons necessary to challenge the coast. The Great Unraveling had wiped the slate clean, allowing these two radically different experiments in human society to flourish. One represented the peak of Iron Age urban technology and maritime trade. The other represented a new experiment in tribal unity and monotheistic faith. The clash between them would provide the narrative engine for the Hebrew Bible, and eventually, the ethical framework of the modern world. The legacy of the ASHES, the birth of the modern mind. The Darwinian reset. The late Bronze Age collapse was, in many ways, a biological event for the species of civilization. Just as a forest fire clears the old, stagnant growth to allow sunlight to reach the floor, the Great Unraveling cleared away the rigid, top-heavy structures of the 13th century BC. The empires that died, the Hittite, the Mycenaean, the Kassite, had become victims of their own complexity. They had reached a point where the cost of maintenance, for their bureaucracies and chariot armies, exceeded the resources their environment could provide. What emerged from the ashes was not a lesser world, but a more resilient one. This was the Great Reset. The survivors were those who were flexible, mobile, and technologically innovative. The 10th and 9th centuries BC represent a Darwinian transition, where humanity moved from a world of god-kings to a world of merchants and citizens. The alphabet, the democratization of information. If iron was the metal of the masses, the alphabet was the technology of the mind. In the Bronze Age, writing, cuneiform, and hieroglyphs was a weapon of state control. It was so complex that it required a lifetime of study to master. This created a scribal elite who stood between the king and the people. Information was centralized and guarded. The Phoenicians, living in the wake of the collapse, realized that the old systems were too slow for the fast-paced, decentralized trade of the Iron Age. They stripped away the hundreds of symbols and logograms, reducing the entire human voice to 22 simple signs. This was a cognitive revolution. For the first time, a merchant or a common soldier could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks. The monopoly on knowledge was broken. When the Greeks adopted this alphabet around 800 BC, they added vowels, creating a tool that could record not just inventories, but the nuances of philosophy, the rhythm of poetry, and the logic of law. The collapse of the Bronze Age palaces was the necessary prerequisite for the invention of the Western mind. Without the Dark Age, to sweep away the old scribal traditions, the world might never have developed the literacy required for democracy. The memory of heroes, mythology as history. The collapse left a deep scar on the collective memory of humanity. For centuries, the people living in the small mud-brick villages of Greece and the Levant looked at the massive ruins of the Bronze Age and wondered, who were these giants? This ruin-struck wonder gave birth to the great mythic cycles. The Mycenaean kings became the heroes of the Trojan War. The chaotic migrations of the sea peoples became the wanderings of Odysseus and Aeneas. The collapse was so traumatic that it was processed through storytelling. Historians now view the Iliad and the Odyssey not as works of fiction, but as stratified memories. They contain genuine Bronze Age details, like boars' tusk helmets and chariot tactics, mixed with Iron Age realities, like iron tools and cremation. These epics served as a cultural glue for the survivors, giving them a shared identity and a sense of belonging to a grand, albeit lost, tradition. The Dark Age was the womb in which the concept of the West was conceived. The shift from palace to polis. The most significant political legacy of the collapse was the death of the redistributive economy. In the Bronze Age, the palace was the center of the world. In the Iron Age, the polis, the city-state, became the center. Because iron made every man a potential soldier, the kings could no longer claim a monopoly on force. The common man now had a seat at the table. In Greece, this led to the development of the hoplite phalanx, a military formation that required cooperation and equality among soldiers. This military equality eventually translated into political equality, leading to the early forms of Greek democracy. In the East, the collapse allowed for the rise of small, independent kingdoms like Judah, Israel, Moab, and the Phoenician city-states. These small players were able to innovate culturally in ways that the massive, stagnant empires of the past never could. The world became a laboratory of ideas rather than a monolith of power. The iron foundation of Rome. Even the rise of Rome can be traced back to the Great Unraveling. Modern DNA studies and archaeology suggest that the groups who would eventually settle central Italy and found Rome were part of the broader Mediterranean migrations triggered by the 1200 BC collapse. The Villanovan culture of early Italy was an Iron Age survivor culture, built on the principles of metallurgy and tribal warfare learned during the Dark Centuries. Rome would eventually perfect the Assyrian model of the professional war machine and the Greek model of the citizen soldier, combining them into the most successful empire in history. But Rome was only possible because the Bronze Age world system had failed. The collapse broke the old East-West barrier, allowing the Mediterranean to become a single, unified cultural space. Why it matters today, the lesson of interdependence. As we look back at the 75,000-year perspective of human development, the Bronze Age collapse stands as the ultimate cautionary tale. It is the world's first example of globalized failure. The great kings of 1200 BC thought they were too big to fail. They believed that their treaties, their gold, and their gods made them invincible, but they failed to account for the multiplier effect of disaster. They didn't realize that a drought in one place, an earthquake in another, and a migration in a third could combine to bring down the entire system. Today, our world is more connected than the Bronze Age ever was. We rely on just-in-time supply chains, global trade, and a delicate climate balance. The sea peoples of our era might not be warriors in ships, but they are the systemic shocks of economic instability, climate displacement, and technological disruption. The story of the Great Unraveling is a reminder that civilization is not a permanent state. It is a choice. It is a fragile agreement between millions of people to cooperate rather than kill. The Bronze Age fell because that agreement broke. The Iron Age rose because humanity learned to find a new way to agree, not through the command of a god king, but through the commonality of the alphabet, the coin, and the law. Troy and the Wilusa Files, the anatomy of a legend. The city of the winds. To the ancient Greeks, Troy was the site of the greatest war ever fought, a 10-year siege that ended an era of heroes. For 19 centuries, historians dismissed it as a fairy tale. That changed in the 1870s when Heinrich Schliemann, guided by the verses of the Iliad, began digging into a massive mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. What he found was not one city, but a layer cake of 9 distinct civilizations, stacked one on top of the other. But the real Troy, the city that fits the timeline of the Great Unraveling, is the layer known as Troy Vi and Via. This was not a small village. It was a sprawling, sophisticated metropolis. It sat at the mouth of the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Geography was Troy's greatest asset and its ultimate curse. Every merchant ship sailing from the Black Sea, carrying grain, gold, or the precious tin of the north, had to wait for the winds to shift at the entrance of the strait. While they waited, they paid taxes to the king of Troy. The city grew fabulously wealthy on the parking fees of the ancient world. In the Hittite archives, this city is called Wilusa, a name that linguistically matches the Greek Ilion. The Hittite connection, Wilusa as a vassal state. While Homer tells a story of a war over a kidnapped queen, the Wilusa files, the diplomatic records from the Hittite capital of Hadusa, reveal a much more cynical reality. Troy was a vassal state of the Hittite Empire. It was the northwestern finger of the Hittite world, a strategic buffer zone against the Ahiyawa, the Mycenaean Greeks. We find letters from Hittite kings like Hattusili III and Tudhaliya IV complaining about the man of Ahiyawa stirring up trouble in Wilusa. The records describe a series of Wilusa wars that lasted for decades. These weren't epic duels between Achilles and Hector. They were proxy wars, trade disputes, and border skirmishes. The Mycenaeans were looking to expand their trade network, and the Hittites were determined to hold the Hellespont. The Trojan War was likely not a single event, but a century of intermittent conflict over the most valuable piece of real estate in the Bronze Age. The seismic end, Troy Vi. Around 1250 BC, the grand city of Troy Vi met a violent end, but it wasn't destroyed by Greek fire. When archaeologists examined the walls, they found massive cracks and shifted stones that could only have been caused by a tectonic event. Troy Vi was a victim of the earthquake storms mentioned in earlier volumes. The survivors didn't leave. They rebuilt. This next phase, Troy Via, is the city of the actual collapse, but the atmosphere had changed. The wide, elegant streets of Troy Vi were replaced by cramped, crowded houses. Large pithy storage jars were buried under the floors of every home, filled with grain and dried meat. This was a city under siege, a population hunkering down and waiting for the end. The sack of Troy Via, the signature of the Sea Peoples. Around 1180 BC, the exact window of the Great Unraveling, Troy Via was burned. This time, the destruction was human. Archaeologists found arrowheads of a type used by both Greeks and northern tribes, skeletons in the streets, and evidence of a massive fire that scorched the citadel. But who did it? Was it Agamemnon's fleet? Or was it the Sea Peoples on their way south? The timing suggests a perfect storm. The Hittite Empire, Troy's protector, was already collapsing. Without the Hittite army to back them up, the Trojans were vulnerable. The Mycenaeans, themselves desperate for resources due to the drought in Greece, likely launched a final, desperate raid to seize Troy's wealth. The fall of Troy was a key thread in the Great Unraveling. It removed the guardian of the Black Sea trade routes. Once Troy fell, the flow of grain and metals from the north was cut off, accelerating the starvation of the central Hittite lands. The city of the winds had finally been silenced, and its fall became the epic poem of a civilization that knew its own end was near. Volume 12, The Pylostablets, 24 Hours to Doom. The Palace of Nestor. While Troy was burning in the east, the palace of Pylos on the west coast of Greece was preparing for its own end. This was the legendary home of King Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greek heroes. Archaeological excavations here produced one of the most remarkable records in history, the last minutes of a dying empire. In the Bronze Age, scribes wrote on clay tablets that were meant to be temporary. They would write the day's accounts and then recycle the clay. The only reason we have these tablets today is because the palace was burned. The intense heat of the destruction fire baked the clay into permanent ceramic, preserving the final records of the palace bureaucracy forever. The Watchmen on the Coast. The Pylos tablets, written in Linear B, reveal a state in a state of high alert panic. One of the most famous tablets contains the Oka command records. It details the deployment of military units to various points along the coast. It literally lists the names of the officers and the number of men sent to watch the sea. The watchmen are guarding the coast. At Owaitno, the command of Mariwo, 50 men from Mitapa. They knew the sea peoples were coming. They didn't call them that, of course. They simply referred to them as the strangers or the ones from the sea. The tablets show the Wanax king stripping the temples of their bronze. Even the sacred bronze of the gods was melted down to make spearheads. They were desperate. The Last Ritual. The most chilling tablet found at Pylos is known as TN 316. It records an emergency sacrifice to the gods. In the final hours before the palace was overrun, the priests were offering gold vessels and perhaps even human lives to the gods of the underworld. The writing is shaky, hurried, and full of errors, a stark contrast to the perfect, orderly bookkeeping of earlier years. The scribe was likely writing as the smoke was already beginning to fill the room. When the palace fell, it was not just a military defeat, it was an administrative erasure. The scribes who wrote those tablets were killed or fled. The system that could coordinate 50 men to watch a beach vanished. Pylos was never rebuilt. For 3,000 years, the tablets lay under the dirt, holding the last thoughts of a world that was trying and failing to count its way out of a catastrophe. The Ugarit dossier, the final days of the world's richest city. The New York of the Bronze Age. If you wanted to see the Bronze Age at its most vibrant, you went to Ugarit. Situated on the coast of modern-day Syria at the site of Ras Shamra, Ugarit was the undisputed center of international commerce. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis where a dozen languages were spoken in the streets and 7 different scripts were used in the counting houses. Ugarit didn't have a massive army or a god king. Its power was its intellect. The scribes of Ugarit were the finest in the world. They were the first to invent a simplified cuneiform alphabet, a 30-letter system that predated the Phoenician alphabet to make trade faster. They kept records of everything: grain shipments from Egypt, wine exports to Crete, and delicate diplomatic treaties with the Hittites. Because of this, when Ugarit fell, it left behind the most detailed death certificate of any city in history. The looming shadow, the letters of the final year. In the late 1920s, archaeologists discovered a stash of nearly 100 clay tablets in the house of a high official named Rapanu. These letters date to the very final months of the city's life, roughly 1180 BC. Reading them is like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The letters reveal a world in total systemic breakdown. The king of Ugarit, Amurapi, was writing frantic messages to his brothers in the neighboring kingdoms, but the brotherhood was failing. The hunger. One letter from the Hittite king demands that Ugarit send grain immediately. It is a matter of life and death, the Hittite writes, but Amurapi responds that he has no grain to give, his own people are starving. The military drain. The Hittites, facing pressure from the north, had drafted Ugarit's entire army and navy. Amurapi writes to the king of Cyprus, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned. All my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca." The country is abandoned to itself. The Seven Ships. The climax of the dossier is a letter describing the arrival of the enemy. Hammurabi reports that 7 ships of an unknown origin have been seen off the coast. They weren't a massive fleet, but they were the vanguard of the sea peoples. In a world where the army was away fighting someone else's war, 7 ships were enough. The invaders landed, used the element of surprise, and put the city to the torch. Archaeologists found the final letters still sitting in the kilns, being fired into ceramic when the city was attacked. The scribes never had the chance to pull them out. Volume 17, The Kassites of Babylon, The Silent Collapse. The Long Peace. While the Mediterranean was screaming, the heart of Mesopotamia, Babylon, was ruled by the Kassites. This was the longest-running dynasty in Babylonian history, lasting nearly 400 years. They were the quiet superpower of the Bronze Age. They weren't interested in conquest. They were interested in culture, religion, and the maintenance of the ancient Sumerian irrigation systems. The Kassite collapse was different from the Mycenaean or Hittite one. It wasn't a sudden fire. It was a biological and economic rot. As the Mega-Drought gripped the region, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers began to fluctuate wildly. The salt levels in the soil rose, killing the wheat crops. The Elamite opportunity. As Babylon weakened, its neighbor to the east, Elam, modern-day Iran, saw an opportunity. The Elamite king Shutruk-Nahant launched a massive raid on Babylon. He didn't just loot the treasury, he looted the history. He carried away the most sacred monuments of Mesopotamia, including the famous stele of Hammurabi and the statue of Marduk. The loss of the statue of Marduk was the psychological end for the Kassites. In the Mesopotamian mind, if the god's statue was gone, the god had abandoned the city. The Kassite dynasty limped on for a few more years, but the great unraveling had broken their spirit. By 1155 BC, the dynasty vanished, replaced by a series of weak local rulers who could barely keep the irrigation canals from clogging with silt. Volume 18, The Mystery of the Kaska, The Mountain Shadow. The Anti-State. To understand why the Hittite Empire fell so easily, you have to understand the Kaska. They lived in the Pontic Mountains of northern Anatolia. To the Hittites, the Kaska were the ultimate barbarians. They had no kings, no cities, and no writing. They were a decentralized, tribal society that lived on pastoralism and raiding. For 500 years, the Hittites fought the Kaska. They built the Great Wall of Hatti, a series of fortresses to keep them out. But the Kaska were like a shadow. You couldn't defeat them because there was no capital to capture. The final pillage. When the drought hit and the Hittite army was distracted by the sea peoples on the coast, the Kaska did what they had always done. They moved. They poured out of the mountains and occupied the fertile valleys. It was likely the Kaska who delivered the final blow to the abandoned capital of Hattusa, burning the empty temples and reclaiming the land for their sheep. The Kaska are a reminder that the great unraveling wasn't just about the sea peoples. It was about the failure of the border. Every empire had a shadow people on its fringe, the Kaska for the Hittites, the Libyans for Egypt, the Arameans for Assyria. When the center failed, the shadows moved in. Volume 19, The Sardinian Connection, the Shardana. The Horned Warriors. In the Egyptian records, one group of sea peoples is depicted with distinct horned helmets and round shields, the Shardana. For a long time, historians noticed the striking similarity between these warriors and the neuragic bronze figurines found on the island of Sardinia. The Shardana represent the Western connection. It appears that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just a move from north to south, but from west to east. These Sardinian mercenaries were the elite special forces of the Mediterranean. They fought for the Egyptians as bodyguards, but they also fought against them as part of the Sea People's coalition. The Great Diaspora. The Shardana proved that the Bronze Age was even more connected than we previously thought. These warriors were traveling thousands of miles, selling their swords to the highest bidder, and bringing the technology of the Western Mediterranean to the shores of the East. When the world fell apart, they were the ones who knew how to navigate the chaos. They didn't just destroy, they traded, they settled, and they carried the seeds of Iron Age technology from one end of the sea to the other. The final inventory, a landscape of ash. To truly grasp the scale of the great unraveling, we must move beyond the generalities of empires and cultures and look at the physical ground. In a period of roughly 50 years, the urban map of the Eastern Mediterranean was virtually erased. Archaeologists call this the destruction horizon. Below is the final inventory of the fallen, the cities that held the line and the cities that became tombs. The Greek mainland, the death of the citadel. In Greece, the collapse was a systematic decapitation of the palace culture. The Wanax system simply ceased to function. Mycenae, the legendary home of Agamemnon, survived an initial attack around 1200 BC, but a second, more violent event around 1150 BC finished it. The palace was burned, and the Lion Gate led to a city of ghosts. Turin's, located just miles from Mycenae, its massive cyclopean walls did not save it. The palace was destroyed by a combination of earthquake and fire. Pylos, as we saw in the Pylos tablets, this site was completely annihilated around 1180 BC. It was never reoccupied, preserving its administrative records in the ash. Thebes, the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, was sacked and burned, with its archives of cylinder seals from as far away as Babylon scattered in the ruins. The Anatolian Plateau, the vanished heartland. The Hittite Empire didn't just lose its capital, it lost its identity. The Central Plateau became a dark zone for nearly 2 centuries. Hattusa, the royal citadel, was evacuated and then burned. The Great Temple, once the religious center of the world, was reduced to stone foundations. Miletus, on the coast, this city saw a transition. It was destroyed as a Hittite Carian stronghold and later rebuilt by Ionian Greek refugees. Troy Via. As discussed, the final Priam's Troy was sacked, with bodies left unburied in the streets, a sign of a city that had no survivors left to mourn. Volume 25, The Levant in Front, the Scorched Coast. The Levant bore the brunt of the Sea People's amphibious assault. Because it was the land bridge between Egypt and the north, it was trampled by both the fleeing and the invading. Ugarit, total destruction. The city was never rebuilt, leaving its massive archives and luxury villas to be swallowed by the sand. Alalak, this Syrian trade hub, was destroyed so thoroughly that its location was forgotten for millennia. Imar, a vital Hittite-controlled city on the Euphrates. The final tablets record the sale of children by their parents just to buy enough grain to survive another week before the city was sacked. Ashkelon and Ashdod. These Canaanite cities were destroyed, but unlike Ugarit, they were immediately rebuilt as Philistine strongholds. Volume 26, The Egyptian Fortress, The Cost of Victory. Egypt is the only great power that can claim it survived the 12th century BC, but the Egypt that emerged was a hollow shell of the Ramesside glory. Pyrameses, the magnificent capital built by Rameses II, had to be abandoned. As the Nile branches shifted due to the drought and silting, the city lost its water supply. The Egyptians literally dismantled the temples and statues and moved them, stone by stone, to the new capital at Tanis. The Theban necropolis. During the reign of Rameses III, the lack of resources led to the first recorded tomb robbing crisis. Even the royal guards began looting the graves of their ancestors to survive the hyperinflation caused by the collapse of trade. Volume 27, The Social Psychology of Collapse. The Loss of World Faith. What did it feel like to live through the Great Unraveling? For 3,000 years, the humans of the Bronze Age had lived in a world of certainty. They believed the gods controlled the rain, the king controlled the gods, and the state controlled the food. When the system failed, it wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a psychological trauma. We see this in the shift in religious art. The confident, serene faces of the Bronze Age gods are replaced by the grotesque or the geometric. There is a sense that the old gods have died or turned their backs. This trauma created the Dark Age mindset, a deep-seated suspicion of large-scale authority. It explains why the Greeks of the Iron Age refused to build palaces for 400 years. They had seen what happens when you put all your faith in a big system, and they decided it was better to be poor and independent than wealthy and enslaved to a failing machine. Volume 28, The Recovery, the 10th Century Dawn. By 950 BC, the Great Unraveling had finally bottomed out. The world was beginning to heal, but it was healing in a new shape. The rise of Neo-Hittite art. In the southeast, the Luwian survivors began building again. Their art was a fusion, Hittite themes with Aramean and Assyrian styles. This was the new Middle East. The Greek Renaissance. On the island of Euboea, the heroine of Lefkandi shows the first signs of large-scale architecture returning to Greece. The Solomonic era. In Jerusalem, the united monarchy of Israel, as recorded in the Bible and debated by archaeologists, represents the first time a highland culture successfully managed the transition from tribal Apuru to a functioning Iron Age state. Volume 29, The Perspective of 75,000 Words. As we conclude this massive deep dive into the collapse, we see that the Late Bronze Age was not just a period in history. It was the first great experiment in human globalization. Its failure was spectacular, but its legacy is the foundation of everything we know. If the Bronze Age hadn't collapsed, the alphabet would likely remain a niche merchant tool, never replacing the official cuneiform. Monotheism might never have emerged from the shadow of the Egyptian and Canaanite state religions. Democracy would have had no vacuum in which to grow, as the palace systems would have continued their top-down rule. The Great Unraveling was a tragedy for those who lived through it, but it was a rebirth for the human species. It taught us that complexity is a double-edged sword, and that true progress often requires the total destruction of the old to make way for the new. The modern echoes of final synthesis. The Late Bronze Age collapse is the premier historical case study for systemic risk. In the modern era, we often view progress as a linear, unstoppable climb. The Bronze Age proves that civilization is not a ladder but a complex web. If you pull enough threads, climate, trade, security, the entire structure can vanish in a single human lifetime. The Great Unraveling was not caused by a single villain. It was a perfect storm of cascading failures. Today, we call this complexity theory. As a system becomes more complex, it becomes more efficient, but it also becomes more brittle. A Mycenaean king was so dependent on tin from thousands of miles away that a pirate raid in the Mediterranean could cause a famine in his mountain home. Today, our tin is semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and oil. The lesson of 1200 BC is that interdependence is a superpower in times of peace, but a death sentence in times of crisis. The lesson of the Sea Peoples. We have spent thousands of words deconstructing the identity of the Sea Peoples. We found that they were not a monolithic army, but a migration of despair. This is perhaps the most relevant echo for our modern world. When the environment fails, as the Mega-Drought proved, people do not stay and die. They move. In the Bronze Age, this movement triggered a militarized refugee crisis. The empires of the time treated the Sea Peoples as a military threat to be defeated, rather than a humanitarian or environmental symptom to be solved. By the time the Egyptian archers were firing into the hulls of the Peliset ships, it was already too late. The system was already broken. The lesson is clear. Environmental stability is the bedrock of national security. When the rain stops falling, the walls of the city, no matter how thick, cannot hold. The wisdom of the Dark Age. It is easy to look at the 400 years of the Greek Dark Age as a failure. But as we saw in the emergence of the alphabet and the Iron Age market economy, it was also a period of intense innovation. The collapse forced humanity to democratize technology. From bronze to iron, moving from an elite expensive metal to a common, accessible one. From hieroglyphs to the alphabet, moving from a secret scribal knowledge to a public phonetic one. From palace to polis, moving from a centralized top-down authority to a decentralized, citizen-based one. The Great Unraveling suggests that sometimes a system must fail for the next stage of human evolution to begin. The Iron Age was grittier, poorer, and more violent than the Bronze Age, but it was also more anti-fragile. It was a world built to survive shocks. The final tally, why we remember. We remember the Bronze Age collapse because it is the first end of the world. It is the moment when humanity first realized that we can lose everything we have built. In the ruins of Ugarit, in the decapitated statues of Hazor, and in the hurried last ritual tablets of Pylos, we see ourselves. We see a world that was modern in its own eyes, a world of international treaties, global luxury, and technological pride, falling victim to the timeless realities of nature and human nature.